Hello, welcome to the Black Ponder. I'm Neil Trotter. Today, we're going to return to Rene Descartes, and we're going to be talking about his work, Meditations on First Philosophy. If I may read you the complete title of this work, because it's pretty long and I don't know it off the top of my head, so let me do that. Meditations on First Philosophy, in which God's existence and the distinction between the human soul and the body are demonstrated. Now, that's a pretty long title. It's not the longest title I've ever read for a book, but it's a pretty long title. And it was published in 1641, just to give you some time reference. So Rene Descartes, very popular philosopher, very influential. His most popular works are Discourse on Method and this one that I'm talking about right now, Meditations on First Philosophy. I already did a video on Discourse on Method, as well as a few of his other lesser known works. So if you want to check those out, go ahead and do that at your leisure, whatever, you check them out or not. But what we're talking about here, Meditations on First Philosophy, many people consider that Descartes' magnum opus, right? His greatest work. And why is that? It's because he's talking about his metaphysics, you know. And for those of you who don't know, metaphysics is basically trying to answer like the ultimate question. Like, what is ultimately there, right? What is this object, what this object actually is, what everything truly is, like what truly is existence, and what is existence ultimately like, you know, what is that stuff that's actually there ultimately like, you know. It gets really deep, and it's very difficult to get into that stuff, because that's what a lot of people turn to religion for, that to start trying to get answers to those questions, because it's hard to answer those questions. A lot of people say, hey, we just came and talk about things like that, so why are we even trying? But there's a whole branch of philosophy that just tries to go that route and try to answer those questions. And Descartes was one of those early philosophers that tried to tackle the issue, right? And one of the things he does in this work is that he tries to prove the existence of God, right? He tries to do that, which is it's hard to do that. It does very hard to do that. In my personal opinion, it's impossible. You can't really do that, really, in my personal opinion. A lot of people disagree with this work, what he's trying to say. I mean, it's a very valiant effort. I applaud him, and a lot of influential philosophers do buy into what he's saying here and have based a lot of their work off of what he's talking about here. And then there's a lot of other philosophers who disagree with him on this particular work, a lot of famous ones, and have kind of built their philosophical writings off of that disagreement. They kind of founded their philosophy off that, and it just kind of went up from there. So you can't really argue that this is not an influential work, despite whether you agree with it or not. It's an incredibly influential work, and for that alone, it deserves a place as probably one of the greatest works in philosophy. So how does Rene Descartes try to prove that God really exists? I'm going to try and break it down as simply as possible, because I don't really want to dwell too much on that, but I'll give you like a loose interpretation of it. Basically what Rene Descartes is saying is that there's these fundamental perceptions, these fundamental interpretations out there, these objects, if you will, that are just out in the universe, that are just part of existence, and these are fundamental. These objects are not based off of just perception, meaning they're not, one person can interpret it different from somebody else. Everybody sees these objects as the same. I mean, they're fundamental. An example of that is geometric shapes, right? Geometric shapes just exist in the world, right? They're in nature. They're just everywhere, and we see them all the time. And if you look at the geometry, you start talking about angles, and Descartes uses a triangle and a square. He talks about how prevalent their geometry and even their trigonometry, the angles and things, they're just so prevalent in existence. And if you really think about it, technology, what we know about nature and how we've advanced as a society is based off of those fundamental objects out there. And you know, everybody knows, I'm gonna just use the example of a circle. Like a circle, you know, the object itself, it exists in the world, and you know, you can't really argue that it doesn't exist. You know, another example is the number pi. You know, right? Different civilizations who had no contact with each other, you know, ancient civilizations discovered pi on their own. You know, because it's just one of those things that just exists out there in the world and in existence. And you can, and with that knowledge, if you're aware of that knowledge, you can start developing and advancing. So what Descartes says about this is that, look, these objects, these geometric objects, these fundamental mathematics that are out there, somebody must have put them in there. You know, we didn't develop these objects on their own. They're not like perceptions. Like when we look at things and people interpret them in different ways. Like when we read a book, for example, and one person might read the book and get something out of it, and then somebody else might read a book and get something completely different from that same book. You know, we have these perceptions and things, and people have various different interpretations. There's objects like the circle or the number pi, which, you know, everybody has the same idea of what that is, right? Those things are fundamental. And Descartes argues that since those things are fundamental and everybody has the same idea of what those things are, the same interpretation, and also he says that we haven't really developed them on our own, they're just there. That insinuates that somebody, some higher being, put them there. That interpretation was put into our minds by something or someone, and Descartes argues that is God. So what Descartes is saying in this, in his meditations, right, is that existence itself implies the existence of God. Like God exists because these fundamental objects, these fundamental interpretations that everybody has, are part of existence. That's actually not a unusual argument. I've actually heard that argument before. You might have heard it before. A lot of people say, you know, I've heard this argument where it's like, you know, God is actually what he is the ultimate mathematician. Because there are like philosophers or scientists out there that says, ultimately the universe is just mathematics. Ultimately, that's what it is. It's just a bunch of formulas, mathematical formulas and objects and shapes, and you can all break it down mathematically. One can argue that there's a grand being or some higher power that developed all this mathematics that the universe works off of, that the universe not only works off of what the universe actually is, right? I've heard that before. I've also heard the argument that no, there's no higher being or nothing. The universe is just a bunch of mathematics, but that's just how the universe is. That's how existence works, right? For a universe to exist, it just has to have these fundamental mathematics behind it. I mean, that's just how it is. That's just a natural way a universe exists, is through these fundamental mathematical properties, right? Even the ancient philosophers like Plato, they said that God ultimately is logic, like ultimate pure logic. I mean, that is God. God isn't really a person or a being. He's more of just the logic itself, this pure logic that existence is based off of. That is what God is. And this is all, you know, metaphysics, right? What we're talking about here. And we could just go back and forth like a ping pong ball, whether God exists because of these fundamental truths, or whether he doesn't exist because these fundamental truths are just how the existence is and it has nothing to do with the higher order or anything like that. We could just go back and forth all day, all night. You know, I mean, I've seen like debates with incredibly smart people unable to prove or disprove these things. And you know, personally, I just think that you can't prove or disprove them at all. You know, I'm a religious person, and you know, I think, you know what, in matters like this, faith comes into play here, and you just kind of have to accept it or not accept it. But the thing is, Descartes, in his work right here, he gets into that. He talks about how there are these limitations that I'm talking about. Like, I think that you can't, the mind is limited and we can't go toward there because you're talking about things that are kind of beyond the scope of human explanation, you know, in my personal opinion. So you can't really go there and think you're going to be successful trying to prove things like the existence of God or disprove the existence of God. Can't really do that. And I would say Descartes actually talks about that in his Meditations of First Philosophy. And I would like to share with you some quotes where he actually brings that up. Even though he's trying to prove the existence of God, he also brings up the fact that the mind has limitations. And if you try and go beyond those limitations, you start running into errors, right? And I want to share with you some quotes about that I agree with 100%. Here's the first one. But what should be noticed is that perceiving is not a case of seeing, touching, or imagining, nor was it ever such, although it seemed that way earlier. But what should be noticed is that perceiving it is not a case of seeing, touching, or imagining, nor was it ever such, although it seemed that way earlier. But it is an inspection of the mind alone, which may be either imperfect and confused as it was earlier, or clear and distinct as it is now, depending on whether I pay more or less attention to what it is composed of. I did a video a while back about Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, which was written after this work, right? But Critique of Pure Reason is pretty cool because it talks about how the difference between perception and what something actually is. René Descartes, I think, even more finely tunes that. And he talks about how, you know, perceptions are one thing, but, you know, you can't make sense of perceptions without the mind, right? The mind is what makes sense of perceptions. And he goes so far as to say, like, really, perceptions are kind of meaningless without the mind being able to interpret what's going on. So ultimately, the mind is where we start getting meaning out of existence. Let me keep going with it. I know now that even bodies are not perceived by the senses or the faculty of imagining, but are perceived only by the mind, and that they are not perceived by being touched or seen, but only by being understood. And therefore, I know clearly that there is nothing that can be perceived by me more easily and more clearly than my own mind. It's kind of like that story about those 6 blind men that touch and that feel an elephant trying to figure out what it is. I don't know if you ever heard that story before, but if you have, it's about 6 blind people, and each one touches a different part of the elephant, right? And based off of the different parts, they come up with a different idea of what the elephant is. Like, one blind person touches the legs of the elephant, and they're like, oh, the elephant is like a pillar. And another person touches the elephant's tail, and they're like, oh, no, the elephant is like a rope. And then, you know, another guy touches the elephant's ear, and he's like, oh, no, the elephant is more like a giant fan, you know. And I mean, that's a perfect example. You know, if it was true that perception alone was what we use to understand reality, then all of those men wouldn't have gotten the same idea of what the elephant was, no matter what part they touched, right? But no, it's the mind. You know, you perceive something in a certain way using the senses, perhaps, and then the mind comes into play after that, and it's like, okay, based off of these senses, what I'm experiencing here, I'm gonna make an idea about what this thing actually is. So the point is, the mind is a very important tool that we can use to start to understand meaning of existence, right? Even though the mind is limited, you know, we got to understand the limitations of the mind. At the same time, it is our tool, not perception alone. Perceptions are more like, or the senses, that's like an interface, right? We interface with perception, and then we use our mind as a tool to interpret the meaning behind things and what things actually are. And that's very important to understand. And I think Descartes would argue, and then he argues in metaphysics, he argues that the mind is our only tool that we can use. Let's keep it going, right? Here's another quote. I should not be surprised if I do not understand the reason for some things that are done by God, and that I should not doubt his existence, because I happen to experience some things and do not comprehend why or how he does them. Since I already know that my nature is very weak and limited, and that the nature of God is immense, incomprehensible, and infinite, I also know from this that there are innumerable things of which I do not know the causes. For this reason alone, I think there is no role in physics for that whole class of causes which are usually sought in purposes, because I think that I cannot investigate God's purposes without temerity. So he even admits it here himself. He admits it that, you know, there's some things that are that we can't understand about God, since the very nature of the mind is, you know, it's weak. It's the mind is actually very strong, but relatively speaking, when it comes to matters of the metaphysics, for example, that's when you start running into the limitations of the mind. And Descartes even admits this. You know, but the thing is, Descartes tries to use philosophy, and you know, he uses the word science, but back then in his day, like, they called philosophy that was a science, you know. So at the same time he's using philosophy to try and explain God's existence. I would argue that the existence of God, that's something that the mind is too weak to come to terms with. I mean, that would be my argument. Here's another quote from Descartes that kind of brings this home, and it's kind of funny. Where do ors originate then? They result from this alone. Since the will extends further than the understanding, I do not restrain it within the limits of the understanding, but apply it even to things that I do not understand. Given that it is indifferent to those things, it is easily deflected from what is true or good, and in that way, I make mistaken judgments or bad choices. That's very interesting. You know, he's talking about where do errors lie. You know, errors don't happen when we don't know things. You know, when we don't understand things. You know, that errors don't really happen then. You know, like we make a mistake. You know, oh my bad, I just didn't know. You know, I didn't know. That's not entirely true. When mistakes happen is when we try to apply our knowledge to things that we don't understand. Think about it. It's like the fact that you didn't know ultimately wasn't the problem why you made the mistake. The problem is you didn't know, yet you still tried to do what you tried to do anyway, despite the fact that you didn't know. And that's where the mistake happened, right? It's okay not to know. You could be, you know, this is like a theme in the Black Ponder, right? So I feel like I'm beating a dead horse, but it's very important, right? I think a lot of people kind of miss this, where it's like, it's okay not to know, and you know, if you realize you don't know something, then you can step away and be like, okay, you know, we probably shouldn't go here yet, or we probably shouldn't do this or try to approach this because we don't know. Then you don't make a mistake, because once you try to do something that's beyond your limits, that's when you start making a mistake, right? Now, it is possible to later learn about something you don't know at first, and maybe come to an understanding about that thing that you don't know, learn about it, educate yourself, and eventually you'll be like, okay, now I know, now I can start doing this stuff, right? And that's how it works, right? That's how we improve our errors, right? But eventually you're gonna get to that limit, because you can only know so much. You know, some people believe you can just know as much, and there's no limit to what we can understand and what we can do. There is a limit. You know, it might be it's up there. It might be hard to see at first glance, but it's there. You know, and mistakes happen when we try to do things that are beyond our limits, or try to explain things that we really don't know anything about. And I guess my argument is that Descartes kind of makes that mistake himself in his own work, where he's admitting that that's the case, and he makes that mistake himself where he's trying to prove the existence of God. But you know, that's kind of beyond the limit of anybody's understanding, really. And so you kind of get into falsehoods, and you get into errors, right? And even, you know, when you try and disprove God, some people are like, well, I can disprove him. No, you can't really do that, can you? I mean, when you really think about it, because, you know, just you know, go on YouTube and watch You know, not those crazy, you know, people like ranting on YouTube, but just watch some very intelligent debates. You know, people with suits and ties, old people. They're, you know, they're very formal, and one guy, maybe he's an atheist, and other guy's maybe a Catholic priest or whatever. And they're like going back and forth, very calm, and they just can't do it. You know, they can't, you know, you can't prove or disprove. You, in the end, you're still left with, man, you know, that was some nice, interesting talk, but, you know, you still didn't prove or disprove whether God exists or not. And I just personally think that's just because you can't do it. Either you make that leap and say, okay, I don't completely understand, comprehend it, but I'm still going to believe in God. And that's what faith is, really. And that's why faith is so pushed so heavily in Christianity, because they understand, like, you know, this beyond understanding, you need to have some degree of faith to know, to truly believe in God, right? Or you can make the decision like, you know, I'm not going to do that. Like, I'm just going to stay in the realm of just human understanding alone. And hey, that's your decision, right? If you want to do that. But either case, this is where you're not making an error, right? Because you are acknowledging the limit of human understanding. So now if you truly do acknowledge that and stay within the confines of that acknowledgement, then you can start understanding the context of where you're coming from, and then now you can start moving forward with meaning, and like, what does life really mean? You can really start to begin to get into the true metaphysics. You might make the argument that, like, hey, you know, so you're telling me I should I should just go beyond human explanation, because that's kind of like this icky subject. How can you start explaining things like that? You can really establish a firm, solid foundation based off of acknowledging the limitations, but still accepting that there's some aspects about existence that exists but are beyond our understanding, right? You can build a whole philosophy off of that, a very solid foundation. And a lot of very important philosophers have done that. Or you could take another approach and you know, go the way of other philosophers and say, hey, the hell with that. I'm gonna just stay within the realm of human understanding, because that's where the logic is. You know, you could take it either way. But I do know several people who have read Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy and have said, you know, I don't really buy Descartes' metaphysics. It's not definitive enough for me. He hasn't really made a strong enough case. Now, I'm not saying that there are several people out there that do buy his metaphysics, and understandably so. Like, he broke it down very nicely. You know, you can go off of it. You can start, in a lot, like I said, a lot of philosophers have. But if you don't buy it, you know, I could understand that too. And to be quite honest with you, I'm one of those people who, yeah, I don't buy this whole, like, just because there are these fundamental objects that exist in nature and in existence, that implies that God exists. Existence itself implies God. I don't really buy that. You either believe in God in a spiritual sense, or you don't. So, I mean, that's just the bottom line. And if that's not enough for you, check out my videos about Soren Kierkegaard's work, because that kind of gets more into, like, okay, if you don't buy into this, then what's left in terms of philosophy? There's a lot left. And well, you know, just one of many philosophers like Kierkegaard kind of breaks that down nicely. But I'm not denying that Meditations on First Philosophy is a good work. I mean, it is a great work. I can see where the influence came from, because it's talking about some really fundamental ideas about metaphysics. And you can definitely use this as a starting point, like a pivot point. Do you buy into this? And if not, you can go this way with philosophy, or you can get this way with philosophy, or you can do some other way. But this is definitely like one of those pivot points. And for that alone, it's really, you know, it's very influential and very powerful. And I did say a lot of quotes that I agree with a lot. It's one of those classical philosophy reads. If you're just getting into philosophy for the first time, this is a good place, one of the good places to start right here. Because it's not that long, it's not that complicated, and it's talking about some fundamental ideas. If you want to get into metaphysics, if that's something you're interested in, that's a good place to start, you know, right here. Well, you've been looking at The Black Ponder. I'm Neil Trotter. Thank you for watching. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.